Today I'm going to be making a walnut and epoxy coffee table out of this nice figured piece of black walnut. So first I'm going to have to build a mold, and to do that I'm using this 4x8 sheet of particle board shelving. Usually I use melamine, but with lumber prices right now a sheet of melamine is about 50 bucks, and this is basically just the inside portion of melamine without the white plastic on the outside, and these are 20 bucks, so I'm going to give this a try and cover it up with tuck tape. So first I'm building the walls of the mold, and I'm doing that with just these 3-inch strips I ripped off. So the finished size of the table I'm making is 48 by 28 inches, so I'm making the mold about 50 by 30. And then once the walls of the mold are all together, I can actually use this as a template to kind of move around the slab and visualize how I want this table to look before I start cutting them. So I don't have a lot of expensive tools like a good track saw, but you can really make do with what you have. What I do have is this $150 Krag track saw jig for my circular saw. And for what I do, just kind of a side business slash hobby, this thing makes really straight cuts and it works great. So now that I have the final design of my table and all the pieces cut, I'm going to go ahead and remove all the bark with a chisel, and I'm also going to try to get rid of as much of the soft, rotten wood as possible. This part I really like to take my time on and make sure I can get as much of it as possible gone, because whatever's left you're going to notice right away as soon as you put the finish on. And once I've got the majority removed by hand, I'll go along everything again with a wire wheel on my angle grinder, and it'll take out anything that remains without damaging any of the hardwood. And now back to our mold. I've got our particle board base here, and I'm just going to layer this in strands of tuck tape. Or if you're in the US, it's called Tyvek tape. It's just house sheathing tape that the epoxy won't stick to. And then I just run a bead of silicone caulking along the bottom of the walls before sticking it onto the base. And toenailing it down with a couple of screws. Then I'll seal all the edges with another bead of silicone and use my finger to even it all out. Now back to the slabs. Since the epoxy I'm using is going to have some black dye in it, I don't want that dye to soak into the wood and potentially stain it, so I'm going to seal all the surfaces with some shellac. And then I'm going to mix up some 2-part epoxy and go along all of the edges, really making sure to get it deep into all the crevices. And the reason for this is when you pour the final epoxy, if the edges weren't sealed, the wood would want to release air bubbles, and as the epoxy hardened, those air bubbles would become trapped and cause you a ton of extra work in the long run. Just trust me and do it, and don't ask how I know. Now a day later, all that epoxy's hardened, and I'm just going to take these outside quick and scuff up the edges with a wire wheel so that the epoxy we pour has something to bond to. Then using a microfiber towel, I'm just going to get rid of as much dust as possible so it's not floating in the epoxy. Now I want to get my mold as level as possible in every direction, so on my workbench I have these adjustable feet, and I'm just going to go around adjusting them until we're pretty much as level as we're going to get. Then using some mold release, I'm just going to spray along all the edges where the silicone seams are. You don't actually have to spray the tuck tape itself because the epoxy won't stick to it. Now the epoxy I'm using is Slow Q casting resin from Rusty Design in Burlington, Ontario. It's a really inexpensive casting epoxy. I think a 12-liter kit is like $180, which is pretty unheard of, and I've used it on a bunch of stuff and have never had any problem with it. So you'll see me always tip the bucket over like this and pour it down the side for basically the exact same reason on why you pour a beer like this, which is not to introduce air bubbles into it. This is a faster cure epoxy. I think it fully cures in like 3 or 4 days, so it's not quite as forgiving with air bubbles, so I try to introduce as few as possible in the mixing process. And that includes when I'm mixing it with the drill. I'll never bring it up to the surface and introduce a bunch of air bubbles. I'll just take the extra time. So I'm going for a slightly translucent black here, and a good trick with this is I'll just use a clear Dixie cup and pull out a little epoxy, and then you can see how dark it actually is, because in the bucket it just looks pitch black. Now it's time for the fun part. And after the weekend, the epoxy is fully cured and I'm ready to demold. So I just took this over to my local wood shop just to get planed and sanded for me, because that saves me about a day of work from having to use a router sled and sand out all of those router marks. So if you can find an option like that, I would just pay whatever it costs to get that done. Because about 20 minutes after I left, I'm back here with a perfectly flat table that I'm ready to start finishing. So first, after measuring everything about 15 times, I cut all the edges square, and then use some 80 grit to take away any remaining saw marks. Next, I'm using this 1/8 inch roundover bit in my router to take down all of the edges. This is just a nice professional looking alternative to a hand sanded edge. And to fill in any little gaps, cracks, or air bubbles left behind after planing, I'm using the CA glue and some spray activator. If you have some bigger voids, you're definitely going to want to mix up some 2-part epoxy, but I really only had some little holes and cracks, so the CA glue is fine. After spraying it with the activator, it's ready to sand in about 25 seconds. I also used some really thin CA glue to shore up some of the parts of the wood that I knew were softer and wouldn't accept a finish as well. And now to sand everything with some 80 grit and repeat the process until all these little gaps and cracks are filled, which can be quite a while. I spent about half a day sanding this table to get it ready. Once you're confident everything's filled and solidified, you can move on to sanding through the grits. For this, I went all the way up from 80 up to 220 grit. Like I said before, this is translucent black epoxy, so you really have to take your time sanding, making sure you're doing an even pattern, getting everything looking like frosted glass as much as possible. Now before moving on, I'll use a flashlight to look over everything to make sure there's no more open pinholes or cracks or uneven sanding marks, because trust me, it's a lot easier to fix it now than finish it and have to sand it off to refinish it again, which is undoubtedly probably going to happen anyway. Now here I wiped everything off with some mineral spirits just to get rid of as much dust as possible for this finish, which in this case is Rubio monocoat. Rubio is a really easy to use, professional looking finish that is my go-to for most projects, especially walnut. I just love the way it makes walnut grain look, and it still has that open grain feeling instead of sealing it in like a polyurethane. It's also really durable and resistant to water and really easy to fix. I did a video comparing 3 of the most popular professional finishes, and you can find that up in the top corner right now. So to apply this is pretty simple. Basically you just drizzle it on like you saw, and then I used these white buffing pads to buff it into the entire surface of the table. After letting it sit and soak in for about 5 minutes, come back with a white terry towel and take off as much of the finish as possible. And that was the bottom side of the table done, so now I'm going to flip and repeat. The reason I finish both sides at the same time is because if you leave one side open overnight, the open wood can absorb moisture and cause the table to cup or bow, and you don't have to fix that problem. Also, once Rubio's fully rubbed off, you can touch it. It's not like a polyurethane that you have to leave to dry for 24 hours. So again, I cleaned this surface off with some mineral spirits and let that dry, and then came back and buffed in the Rubio. And again, after about 5 minutes, I came back with a brand new terry towel and took off all of the excess finish. You really want to take your time with this, flipping the towel all the time, and once I get near the end, I'll usually grab a fresh towel and just buff everything again to make sure all of the finish is fully removed. Well, remember how I said you were almost undoubtedly going to have to refinish it? Those soft spots I tried to shore up with some CA glue, didn't quite accept it as well as I'd liked, so now I'm going to fill those in with some Osmo and let that dry for a couple of days, and then we'll sand it down and try this all over again. Now those spots look quite a bit better, and this will look a lot better after I get another coat on it. So between coats I like to use a maroon pad on my orbital sander, or you can use 320 or 400 grit. Just like sanding with all the other grits, you've got to really take your time and make sure your pattern is really consistent and you get the epoxy looking like frosted glass. Then same as before, I'm going to wipe off as much dust as possible and use some mineral spirits. And then apply another coat of Rubio the same way as before. Now that's looking really good, and it'll look even better after it cures for a day or two. So time to go home and go to bed and come back in the morning and start whipping up some steel legs. I'm using some 1x3 steel tubing for this. The thickness is 0.083 inches. I'm just making up some simple rectangular legs that are going to be the exact same width as the table. So using a chop saw, I'll just cut all my pieces on 45-degree angles. Then with an angle grinder, I'll clean up all the edges and get them ready for welding. Like all my other tools, I just have a cheap, like $300 flux core welder. But it actually works great for the hobby welder that welds 3 times a year like I do. So first I make sure everything's square and just tack it into place, and then I'll continue on doing the full welds later. And I know I'm not a great welder, so feel free to trash that in the comments as much as you like. Now behind every bad welder is an excellent angle grinder, so I'm just going to grind down all these welds and get them as flush to the original steel as possible. I know a lot of people, especially woodworkers, are scared of metal work, but it's really less daunting than it seems. Obviously, to be a professional, you would have to spend a lot of time and get really good, but if you're just going to grind off your welds, it's really not that hard to get a fairly decent result. And then I'm just cleaning off all the rust with a wire wheel. And then drilling some holes to secure it to the table and also for some feet. And then I was going to get these powder coated, but I thought I'd go full DIY on this, so I'm just using some rust coat primer. And then a semi-gloss black. And then you're going to want to let these dry for about 3 days without even touching them to really prevent any scratches or blemishes. And a few days later, it's time to mount these on the table. So first I'm just using a drill bit the same size as what I used to drill the holes through the steel, just to mark the place that I'm going to have to put the inserts in. Then once the 4 holes are marked, I can come back with the correct size drill bit for the threaded inserts and bore those out a little bit. I also like to put a piece of tape on the drill bit just to make sure that I don't go too deep and end up coming through the other side of the table. Then I'll use a slightly oversized bit just in reverse, just to recess it down a little bit so I don't get any wood tear out from the inserts. For bolts, I just kept it simple, and I'm using these standard 1/4 inch bolts. I think they're about 1.5 inches long, and all you really have to make sure is that your bolt thread pattern is the same as the threaded insert thread pattern. You can also see some swirls left behind by the angle grinder here that I probably should have took a little bit more time to sand out, but this was on the underside of the piece, so I wasn't too worried about it. And after adding some leveling feet, this piece is done, and I'm going to take it outside for some pictures. Also, this is way heavier than I thought. I didn't weigh it, but I'd guess probably around 130 or 150 pounds. So that's it for this build. This time let me know in the comments what you think of the translucent black epoxy. I was skeptical at first, but now seeing the finished product, I think I actually like it better than the solid black epoxy, so let me know your thoughts on that. I've also included a link in the description to my Amazon page that has a whole bunch of one-of-a-kind stuff that I build, including this table that I'm going to sell on there. Thanks again for watching, and if you haven't already, check out my channel. I do a whole bunch of builds like this river coffee table that I put a real river in.